The most expensive mistakes are usually signed with complete confidence. The private dining room on the top floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants overlooked a skyline glowing beneath the last colors of sunset. Inside, everything reflected quiet success. Crystal glasses caught the warm light. A polished walnut table stretched across the room beneath elegant chandeliers. Leather folders rested beside expensive fountain pens. Fresh coffee filled the air with a rich aroma that mixed naturally with the calm conversations of people accustomed to making decisions worth billions of dollars. At the head of the table sat Daniel Brooks, a 43-year-old billionaire chief executive officer whose reputation had been built on discipline, patience, and remarkable judgment. Investors admired him because he rarely made emotional decisions. Employees respected him because he always demanded evidence before certainty. Tonight appeared no different. After 8 months of negotiations, legal reviews, financial modeling, and countless executive meetings, his company stood only moments away from approving what business analysts had already described as one of the largest acquisitions of the year. Every person around the table believed history was about to be made. 7 senior executives occupied the seats surrounding Daniel. Each had spent months reviewing financial reports, market projections, and operational forecasts. The chief financial officer confidently summarized the final presentation displayed across the enormous digital screen. Every graph pointed upward. Every projection suggested steady growth. Every conclusion supported the same recommendation. Sign tonight. Move forward tomorrow. Celebrate next quarter. The atmosphere carried absolute certainty. Daniel quietly removed the cap from his fountain pen and rested its polished tip above the signature page. Across the room, Emily Carter entered carrying a silver serving tray with freshly brewed coffee. At 28 years old, she had worked at the restaurant long enough to recognize important clients without ever interrupting important conversations. Her white button shirt remained perfectly pressed despite the long shift. Her black apron and polished shoes reflected the same quiet professionalism she brought to every table. She greeted each guest with a warm smile before carefully placing coffee beside every executive. No one paid particular attention to her. She expected nothing different. She had learned long ago that people usually noticed the uniform before the person wearing it. As she reached Daniel's chair, he offered a polite thank you before returning his attention to the presentation. Emily nodded respectfully and stepped away toward the service entrance. Her work was nearly finished. One final glance toward the large display happened almost by accident. A colorful chart illustrating customer growth remained visible, while another slide highlighted projected revenue over the next 5 years. Emily slowed her pace for only a moment. Something about the relationship between those two charts quietly unsettled her. She looked again, then once more. The room continued discussing expansion strategies, operating margins, and future market opportunities. No one appeared concerned. Yet the more Emily compared the trend lines in her mind, the less comfortable she became. She did not understand every detail of corporate acquisitions, but she understood patterns. Years earlier, before family responsibilities forced her to leave community college, accounting had been her favorite subject. Her father often reminded her that numbers were like honest friends. If 2 honest friends told completely different stories, someone should ask why. Emily lowered her eyes and reminded herself that 7 experienced executives had already reviewed every page of the agreement. Surely they had noticed anything important. She quietly reached the brass handle leading back toward the restaurant hallway. Then another slide appeared on the screen. The projected revenue accelerated dramatically while customer retention from the earlier chart appeared almost unchanged. Her heartbeat became noticeably faster. It was only one detail. Perhaps she misunderstood. Perhaps there was an explanation hidden somewhere inside the hundreds of supporting documents. She took another step toward the exit before stopping completely. Behind her, Daniel positioned the fountain pen above the final signature line. The lead attorney smiled confidently and closed his notebook. Everything is ready. Emily slowly turned around, drew a careful breath, and spoke with gentle respect that carried no trace of arrogance. "Excuse me, sir. Before you sign, may I ask one question about the numbers?" Daniel Brooks slowly lowered the fountain pen without allowing its polished tip to touch the signature line. The movement lasted only a second, yet every conversation around the table disappeared as if someone had quietly closed a heavy door between the room and the outside world. 7 senior executives turned toward Emily Carter with expressions that blended surprise and polite disbelief. She immediately wished she could take back the interruption. Her intention had never been to challenge experienced professionals. She had only hoped to understand something that no longer seemed to fit together. Daniel looked directly at her, his voice remaining calm and respectful. "Please go ahead." Emily kept both hands around the silver serving tray as though it somehow gave her confidence. "I may be completely mistaken, sir," she began softly, "but the customer retention chart shown a few minutes ago appears almost flat during the last 3 quarters. The revenue forecast on the current slide assumes strong acceleration during exactly the same period. I was wondering how those 2 trends support each other." Silence settled across the room. The chief financial officer smiled politely before speaking first. "Those charts come from different models. They are connected through later assumptions." Another executive nodded confidently. "It makes sense once the integration phase begins." Emily offered a small respectful smile. "Thank you. I only asked because the graphs seemed to tell different stories. I assumed perhaps I misunderstood something." Daniel never looked away from the presentation screen. "Please return to the previous slide," he said. The strategy director pressed the remote, restoring the earlier chart beside the current projection. Daniel studied both images for nearly half a minute without speaking. "Display them together." 2 large graphs now filled the screen. One suggested customer loyalty had slowed noticeably. The other projected aggressive revenue expansion built upon continuing customer growth. Daniel folded his arms. "Walk me through the connection." The chief financial officer confidently opened another document explaining future market expansion. Daniel listened carefully before asking a single question. "Which report validates these assumptions?" Several executives immediately opened laptops. Digital folders appeared one after another across the screen. Minutes passed. Someone searched archived market research. Another executive reviewed financial appendices. The confident rhythm that had filled the room earlier gradually disappeared beneath quiet keyboard clicks. Emily carefully stepped backward toward the service entrance, believing her role had ended. Before she reached the door, Daniel spoke without turning around. "Miss Carter, would you remain for another few minutes?" She hesitated before answering. "Of course, sir." Nearly 10 minutes later, the supporting report finally appeared. Daniel examined every page with remarkable patience. "This market analysis was completed 18 months ago," he observed. "Where is the updated validation?" No one answered immediately. The strategy director searched another folder. The operations executive reviewed recent regional reports. The chief financial officer quietly admitted that revised customer research had not yet been incorporated into the final valuation package. Daniel remained composed. "Then the projected growth depends partly upon assumptions that have not been independently verified." Nobody challenged the statement. A junior financial analyst sitting near the far end of the table cautiously raised one hand. "Sir, if we update the revenue model using the newest retention figures that arrived last month, the projections may change." Daniel nodded. "Please do it." The analyst connected his laptop to the presentation system. One number changed, then another. The colorful charts slowly reshaped themselves before everyone's eyes. Expected returns became noticeably smaller. Operating margins narrowed. Long-term profitability remained positive, but the comfortable safety margin presented only minutes earlier had quietly disappeared. Daniel watched every revision without visible emotion. Finally, he turned toward Emily. "May I ask what made you notice this?" Emily lowered her eyes for a moment before answering. "My father repaired antique clocks after serving in the Navy. He always told me that when 2 gears move in different directions, the problem is rarely the gear you notice first. It is usually something deeper inside the mechanism." Those charts reminded me of that lesson. Daniel looked once more at the revised financial model. The room had not become quieter because people had run out of answers. It had become quieter because everyone suddenly understood that one respectful question had revealed something months of certainty had quietly overlooked. Daniel Brooks remained standing in front of the presentation screen while the revised financial model continued calculating across the display. No one reached for another cup of coffee. No one looked at the untouched contract resting on the polished walnut table. The atmosphere had changed so completely that even the quiet sound of keyboards seemed unusually loud. Every executive now understood that the evening had crossed an invisible line. This was no longer a celebration. It had become an investigation. Daniel slowly turned toward the 7 executives who had supervised every stage of the acquisition. His expression revealed neither anger nor disappointment. Instead, it reflected something that made several people far more uncomfortable. Genuine curiosity. "I want to understand exactly how this happened," he said calmly. "Not who to blame. Not yet. I want to know where our process stopped asking questions." The chief financial officer adjusted his glasses before answering. Every department completed its assigned review. Daniel nodded once. "I believe that." His voice remained measured. "What I am asking is different. Who verified that every department used the same updated assumptions before the final valuation was approved?" Silence answered him. The operations director looked toward the strategy executive. The strategy executive glanced at the finance team. The finance team quietly reviewed their notes. Nobody had intentionally ignored the discrepancy. Everyone had simply trusted that another department had already confirmed it. Daniel watched the realization spread across the room without raising his voice. "Confidence is valuable," he said. "But confidence is never a substitute for verification." Emily Carter remained beside the service entrance, holding the silver tray against her side. She wished she could quietly leave and allow the meeting to continue without her presence. She never imagined that a simple observation would reshape an executive discussion. Daniel noticed her hesitation. "Miss Carter," he said kindly, "please stay for a few more minutes. Your perspective has become part of this conversation." Emily nodded respectfully. "Yes, sir." A junior analyst carefully raised his hand again. "There may be another issue." The room immediately focused on him. He projected a different spreadsheet onto the large display. When the updated customer retention figures are synchronized with the current operating costs instead of the previous quarter's assumptions, the acquisition premium becomes much higher than originally presented. Daniel stepped closer to the screen. "Run the complete scenario." Rows of numbers refreshed one after another. Forecasts shifted. Risk indicators changed color. Expected returns narrowed again. Finally, the revised summary appeared. The room fell silent. The projected financial exposure had increased dramatically compared with the version prepared for signature. Daniel folded his hands and read every figure twice before speaking. "If we had signed tonight, how much additional exposure would we have accepted under these assumptions?" The analyst swallowed before answering. "Approximately $200 million over the first several years, sir, assuming the current market conditions continue." Nobody spoke. The numbers settled across the room with greater weight than anyone expected. Daniel slowly closed the leather contract folder. "Then tonight we did not postpone a transaction," he said quietly. "We postponed a mistake." Several executives lowered their eyes. None attempted to defend themselves. They understood that the issue was not dishonesty. It was complacency created by months of agreement. Daniel looked toward Emily once more. "You noticed the inconsistency in less than a minute." "What?" Emily thought carefully before answering. "Because I was not trying to prove the report was correct," she replied softly. "I was only trying to understand it. When I could not make both charts tell the same story, I assumed I was missing something. Asking the question seemed better than pretending I understood." Daniel smiled almost imperceptibly. "That answer may be worth more than every presentation we reviewed tonight." The city lights beyond the glass walls continued shining across Manhattan as the restaurant gradually emptied below. Inside the private dining room, one unsigned signature had quietly protected an entire company. Daniel picked up the fountain pen, carefully placed its cap back into position, and returned it to the table. "Beginning tomorrow morning," he said with calm authority, "an independent audit will review every assumption behind this acquisition. Every number will earn its place. Every conclusion will be challenged. And from this day forward, no voice inside this company will ever be ignored simply because of a job title." Tonight has reminded us that wisdom does not always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it quietly carries the coffee. The restaurant had officially closed more than an hour earlier, yet the private dining room remained illuminated as though time itself had paused. Outside, the Manhattan skyline shimmered beneath thousands of lights reflected across the glass walls. Inside, every screen still displayed financial models that only a short time before had inspired complete confidence. Now they inspired careful silence. Daniel Brooks took one slow walk around the conference table before stopping beside the large presentation screen. His eyes moved from one executive to another. No one avoided responsibility, but no one appeared eager to speak first. The confidence that had filled the room earlier had been replaced by thoughtful reflection. Daniel finally broke the silence. "Tomorrow morning, an independent review begins," he said calmly. "Not because I believe anyone acted dishonestly, but because every important decision deserves to survive fresh scrutiny." The chief financial officer nodded. "That is reasonable." Another executive quietly added, "We should have compared every revised assumption before combining the models." Daniel looked toward him. "That sentence matters more than any explanation tonight." Emily Carter still stood near the service entrance with the silver tray resting comfortably against one arm. She felt increasingly certain that she no longer belonged inside the discussion. She had asked one respectful question. Everything else belonged to the leadership team. She took a careful step toward the hallway before Daniel spoke once again. "Miss Carter." She stopped immediately. "Yes, sir. Would you mind answering one more question?" Emily offered a polite smile. "I will do my best." Daniel rested one hand on the back of a leather chair. "When you first noticed those charts, what convinced you to speak instead of assuming experienced people already had the answer?" Emily considered the question for several seconds before replying. "Nothing convinced me that I was right," she answered honestly. "I only knew that I was confused. I thought perhaps someone could explain what I failed to understand. If there was a simple explanation, then I would learn something. If there was not, then perhaps asking the question would still be useful." The room became quiet once again. Daniel smiled faintly. "That difference is important," he said. "You were searching for understanding, not recognition." Emily nodded. "My father believed curiosity should always be stronger than pride." Several executives exchanged thoughtful glances. The words sounded simple, yet everyone in the room understood how easily confidence could silence curiosity after months of successful work. One senior analyst cleared his throat. "Sir, while reviewing the synchronized projections, I found another inconsistency." Daniel turned immediately. "Show us." A revised spreadsheet appeared on the screen. Additional operating costs associated with regional expansion had been linked to an outdated forecast instead of the current market conditions. The analyst carefully explained every adjustment while another member of the finance team independently verified each calculation. Daniel listened without interruption. Every figure received a second review. Every assumption received another question. The process moved slowly, but no one complained. The atmosphere had changed completely. Speed no longer mattered. Accuracy did. Nearly 30 minutes later, the analyst looked up from the final report. "The preliminary review confirms the earlier estimate," he said quietly. "Signing tonight would likely have exposed the company to approximately $200 million in unnecessary financial risk over the coming years." Daniel slowly closed the last open spreadsheet. He neither celebrated nor expressed frustration. Instead, he looked around the room with calm conviction. "Tonight did not reveal weak numbers," he said. "It revealed a weak habit. We became comfortable agreeing with one another before we finished challenging our own assumptions." No one attempted to disagree. Even the executives who had built the original models understood exactly what he meant. Daniel carefully placed the signed agreement back inside its leather folder. "The acquisition is postponed until every independent review has been completed," he announced. "From this point forward, every major decision inside this company will include one final question before approval." "What have we not questioned yet?" Emily quietly gathered the remaining coffee cups from the polished table. She moved with the same calm professionalism that had marked every step of her evening. Nothing in her expression suggested she expected gratitude. She simply completed her work before offering a respectful nod to everyone in the room. As she reached the doorway, Daniel watched her leave and realized that the most valuable lesson of the evening had not appeared in a presentation, a financial model, or an executive report. It had arrived with a simple question asked by someone who cared. More about understanding the truth than being noticed. Morning sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of Brooks' Capital headquarters, replacing the warm restaurant lighting with a clear brightness that seemed to expose every unanswered question. The celebration that had been scheduled for the acquisition had quietly disappeared from the executive calendar. In its place stood a single meeting titled Independent Verification. Daniel Brooks arrived before anyone else, carrying nothing except a leather notebook and the unsigned agreement from the previous evening. He placed both items on the conference table before looking across the empty room where so many confident presentations had taken place over the years. Confidence had built the company, but discipline had protected it. He intended to make certain they never forgot the difference again. By 8 o'clock, independent auditors, senior analysts, legal advisors, and the 7 executives had gathered around the table. None of the auditors had participated in the original transaction. Their responsibility was simple. Question every assumption. Verify every conclusion. Trust no spreadsheet until every supporting figure had been confirmed. Daniel opened the meeting with only a few words. Forget what you believe is true. Show me what you can prove. The room became completely silent before the review began. Hour after hour, financial models were rebuilt from the beginning rather than adjusted from existing files. Market forecasts were compared against the newest research. Customer retention reports were synchronized with current operating expenses instead of historical estimates. Regional expansion costs were recalculated using updated supplier contracts. Every correction appeared small by itself. $5 million here, $12 million there, $8 million somewhere else. Yet as the numbers accumulated, the difference grew steadily larger. Shortly after noon, the lead auditor projected the final reconciliation onto the enormous display. Every participant leaned forward. The revised valuation showed that proceeding with the acquisition under the previous assumptions would likely have exposed Brooks Capital to more than $200 million in avoidable financial losses over the following years. No dramatic reaction filled the room. There were no raised voices. There was only a long, thoughtful silence as everyone absorbed what the figures now revealed with unmistakable clarity. Daniel slowly stood and walked toward the screen. He studied every page before turning toward the executives. The numbers were never our greatest problem, he said calmly. Our process was. No one attempted to argue. The chief financial officer spoke first. We became too confident in one another's work. Another executive nodded. Each department assumed someone else had already verified the revisions. Daniel folded his hands. That assumption nearly cost this company more than $200 million. The auditors confirmed that none of the discrepancies appeared intentional. Instead, they reflected a gradual breakdown in independent verification as teams became increasingly comfortable relying upon previous approvals. Daniel thanked the auditors before requesting that everyone except the executive leadership remain outside for a few minutes. As the conference room doors quietly closed, 7 executives remained seated across from the man they had worked beside for years. Daniel looked at each of them with the same calm expression he had maintained since the previous evening. Every one of you has contributed to this company, he began. Your experience helped build what we have today. That deserves respect. But leadership also carries responsibility when our standards begin to decline. No one interrupted him. They already understood what the independent review had confirmed. Daniel continued. This conversation is not about punishment. It is about accountability. Before any decisions are made, each of you will have an opportunity to explain where your review process failed and what you believed another department had already verified. Outside the conference room, employees quietly continued their work without knowing the full significance of what had taken place during the last 24 hours. Across the city, Emily Carter began another ordinary shift at the restaurant, arranging coffee cups, greeting guests with her usual warm smile, and believing that her brief conversation with a businessman had already become a distant memory. She had no idea that inside one of Manhattan's most respected companies, an entire leadership team was now rebuilding its culture around the simple habit she had demonstrated without realizing it. The courage to ask one honest question before accepting an easy answer. The conference room remained quiet after the independent auditors finished presenting their findings. No one questioned the conclusion anymore. Every supporting document had been verified. Every revised calculation had been reviewed twice. The result remained unchanged. Brooks Capital had narrowly avoided more than $200 million in unnecessary financial exposure because one simple question had interrupted an evening that everyone believed was already finished. Daniel Brooks closed the final report and looked around the table with calm determination. Facts deserve action, he said quietly. Not because they embarrass us, but because they teach us. One by one, the 7 senior executives met privately with him throughout the afternoon. Each conversation lasted nearly an hour. Daniel asked the same question every time. At what point did you stop verifying and begin assuming? The answers were different in detail, but remarkably similar in meaning. One executive admitted he trusted another department to validate the revised market assumptions. Another believed the updated customer retention study had already been incorporated into the financial model. A third explained that the legal review focused on contractual language instead of operational projections. None of them intended to mislead anyone. They had simply relied upon one another until responsibility became shared so broadly that it belonged to no one. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. He thanked each executive for answering honestly before writing several notes inside his leather notebook. By early evening, every conversation had reached the same conclusion. The company had not suffered from a lack of intelligence. It had suffered from a gradual loss of disciplined curiosity. The following morning, the executive leadership team gathered once again. This meeting felt completely different from every previous discussion. There were no presentation slides celebrating future growth. There were no polished speeches about opportunity. Only facts remained. Daniel stood beside the conference table instead of sitting at its head. Leadership begins with accountability, he said. Our responsibility is not only to make successful decisions. Our responsibility is to build systems that continue protecting the company when experienced people become comfortable. He paused before continuing. After careful consideration, I have decided that our executive leadership structure must change. The room remained silent. Daniel spoke with the same calm respect that had defined every conversation since the restaurant meeting. Effective immediately, the 7 executive positions involved in this review will be dissolved and replaced through a new selection process based upon independent verification, cross-functional accountability, and demonstrated willingness to challenge assumptions. No one argued. Several executives quietly nodded. Although disappointed, they understood the reasoning. Daniel personally thanked every one of them for years of service and assured them that the decision reflected responsibility for the process rather than personal judgment of their character. After the meeting ended, employees throughout headquarters noticed unusual activity as organizational announcements began appearing across the company's internal network. Rumors spread quickly, but Daniel instructed the communications department to release only verified information. Respect remained important even during difficult transitions. Later that afternoon, Daniel found himself thinking about the young waitress whose question had changed everything. He asked his executive assistant to locate the restaurant and arrange a private reservation for the following evening. Please make certain she understands this is simply an invitation to thank her, he said. Nothing more. Across the city, Emily Carter finished another lunch. Shift exactly as she had finished hundreds before it. She greeted every guest warmly, collected empty coffee cups, straightened neatly arranged tables, and quietly helped a new employee learn the evening service routine. She had not watched business news. She had not searched the internet for information about Brooks Capital. She assumed the executives had solved whatever problem existed and moved forward with their lives. While she polished silverware near the service station, the restaurant manager approached with a thoughtful expression. Emily, he said gently. Someone called asking whether you would be working tomorrow evening. They said the request comes directly from Mr. Daniel Brooks. Emily looked up in genuine surprise, uncertain why one respectful question from 2 days earlier could possibly still matter. The following evening arrived with a gentle spring rain that softened the lights of Manhattan into shimmering reflections across the sidewalks. Inside the restaurant, Emily Carter prepared the private dining room exactly as she had prepared hundreds before it. Fresh flowers rested at the center of the polished walnut table. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers. Every place setting stood perfectly aligned. She reminded herself that this was simply another reservation. Whatever Daniel Brooks wished to discuss, she intended to remain the same person she had always been. When Daniel entered a few minutes later, he was alone. There were no attorneys, no executives, no financial analysts, and no cameras. He wore a simple navy suit without the formal presence that had surrounded him during the acquisition meeting. His expression carried quiet gratitude rather than authority. Emily greeted him with the same warm professionalism she offered every guest. Good evening, sir. Daniel smiled. Good evening, Miss Carter. Thank you for agreeing to see me. She gently shook her head. I am working, sir. There was nothing to agree to. Daniel appreciated the answer more than she realized. It reminded him that dignity often revealed itself through ordinary words. After she served coffee, he waited until the room became completely quiet. I wanted to thank you personally, he said. Because of your question, our independent review prevented a mistake that would have cost the company more than $200 million. Emily listened respectfully before answering. I am glad everyone had the opportunity to review the information again. Daniel looked at her with genuine curiosity. Most people would have asked whether they saved the company. You asked whether everyone had another opportunity to understand the numbers. What? Emily folded her hands in front of her apron. Because I never believed I saved anything. Your analysts found the evidence. Your auditors verified the facts. Your leadership made the decision. I only asked a question that happened to matter. Daniel remained silent for several seconds. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than a speech could have achieved. Yesterday, he said quietly, I restructured our executive leadership team. 7 executive positions were eliminated after the review confirmed repeated failures in our verification process. Emily lowered her eyes. I am sorry people lost their positions. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. So am I. None of them were dishonest people. They were experienced professionals who gradually stopped challenging one another. The company deserved a stronger process, and they understood that. Emily answered with calm sincerity. Sometimes good people make mistakes when everyone agrees too quickly. Daniel smiled faintly. That sentence belongs in every boardroom. He reached into his leather portfolio and carefully placed a handwritten letter on the table beside her. This is not an employment offer, he explained before she could misunderstand. It is simply my personal gratitude. You reminded me of something I should never have forgotten. Leadership is measured by the willingness to listen before it is measured by the authority to decide. Emily looked at the envelope, but made no effort to open it. Thank you, sir. Daniel then removed a small leather notebook identical to the one he carried every day. The cover was embossed with the company logo but contained no expensive decoration. This notebook represents a new tradition, he said. Every executive meeting will begin with one empty page titled Questions We Have Not Asked Yet. That idea came from you. Emily smiled for the first time that evening with quiet warmth. Then I hope people fill every page. Daniel laughed softly. So do I. As she prepared to return to her duties, Daniel stood and extended his hand. Emily accepted the handshake with the same calm confidence she had shown from the beginning. There was no applause, no dramatic celebration. Only 2 people sharing a moment of mutual respect earned through honesty and humility. As Daniel watched her return to serving other guests with exactly the same care she had shown before any of this happened, he understood that true character never changes when recognition arrives. It simply continues doing the right thing even after the world finally begins to notice. Several weeks passed, yet the quiet conversation inside the restaurant never left Daniel Brooks's thoughts. The handwritten notebook he had placed on the conference table during every executive meeting gradually became more than a symbolic gesture. At the beginning of each discussion, before financial projections appeared on the screen or quarterly reports were distributed, every participant now answered the same question. What have we not questioned yet? The tradition felt unfamiliar at first. Some executives hesitated. Others struggled to challenge ideas that seemed obvious. Slowly, however, the atmosphere inside Brooks Capital began to change. Analysts who once remained silent started offering thoughtful observations. Junior managers found themselves invited into meetings that had previously been reserved only for senior leadership. Departments stopped assuming that another team had already verified critical information. Instead, they independently confirmed every important figure before reaching a conclusion. Daniel watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. The company had not become slower. It had become stronger. Every decision now rested upon a deeper foundation of discipline rather than confidence alone. One afternoon, the chairman of the board reviewed the new procedures and looked toward Daniel with genuine curiosity. Your leadership meetings feel different, he observed. People seem more willing to disagree. Daniel smiled gently. I would rather hear respectful disagreement before making a decision than discover expensive agreement afterward. The chairman nodded thoughtfully. Where did that philosophy come from? Daniel looked through the conference room window toward the Manhattan skyline before answering. From someone who reminded me that asking one honest question can protect years of hard work. He offered no further explanation. The lesson mattered more than the identity behind it. Across the city, Emily Carter continued living exactly as she had before the extraordinary evening changed the direction of a major corporation. She greeted every guest with warmth, memorized regular customers' favorite coffee orders, helped new employees learn the rhythm of busy dinner service, and quietly returned home after every shift. She never mentioned the business meeting to coworkers because she believed it belonged to the people responsible for those decisions, not to her. The handwritten letter Daniel had given her rested inside a small wooden drawer beside family photographs and her father's old pocket watch. Whenever she opened the drawer, she smiled at the familiar reminder that curiosity and kindness could quietly travel much farther than anyone expected. One rainy Friday evening, the restaurant manager approached Emily before the dinner rush. "Someone would like to speak with you for a moment," he said. Emily looked toward the entrance and saw Daniel waiting near the reception area. Once again, he had arrived alone. This time he carried no portfolio, no contracts, and no business reports. Only the same calm expression she remembered from their previous conversation. "Good evening," he said warmly. "I hope I am not interrupting your work." Emily smiled. "Not at all, sir. How may I help you?" Daniel looked around the dining room, where guests laughed softly beneath warm lights. "Actually," he replied, "I came to tell you something." Emily listened quietly. "Our company completed its first quarter under the new review process today. We rejected 2 proposals because junior analysts identified assumptions that senior executives overlooked. Both times, the questions proved correct." Emily's eyes brightened with genuine happiness. "That sounds like everyone learned something valuable." Daniel nodded. "They did, including me." He paused before continuing. "I used to believe leadership meant having the best answers. Now I believe leadership begins by creating a place where every thoughtful question feels welcome." Emily looked toward the dining room before answering. "People usually notice confidence first, but understanding often begins with humility." Daniel smiled. "That sentence deserves a place in my notebook as well." Emily laughed softly. "Then make sure you leave room for more questions underneath it." Daniel promised that he would. As he walked toward the exit, he noticed employees, guests, and managers moving naturally through another ordinary evening. Nothing about the restaurant suggested that one quiet conversation had helped reshape the culture of a company worth billions of dollars. Yet Daniel understood that extraordinary change rarely announced itself with noise. More often, it arrived quietly, wearing an apron, carrying a silver coffee tray, and choosing the courage to ask one sincere question before everyone else decided there was nothing left to ask. 1 year later, the conference room at Brooks Capital looked almost identical to the one where an unsigned contract had quietly changed the future of the company. The polished walnut table remained in the center of the room. The floor-to-ceiling windows still framed the Manhattan skyline. Financial reports once again rested neatly beside leather notebooks and cups of fresh coffee. Yet one important detail had changed forever. Before every meeting officially began, the first slide on the presentation screen displayed only one sentence. "What have we not questioned yet?" Nobody considered it a formality anymore. It had become the foundation of the company's culture. Senior executives waited patiently while analysts, managers, interns, and specialists shared observations without concern for titles or rank. Good ideas no longer belonged to positions. They belonged to evidence. During that year, Brooks Capital completed several successful acquisitions, avoided multiple unnecessary risks, and earned recognition for building one of the most disciplined review processes in the industry. Investors praised the company's consistency, but Daniel Brooks always knew the real reason behind those achievements. It was never a single policy. It was a simple habit. Listen before deciding. Verify before believing. Question before signing. One afternoon, Daniel stood before a group of newly promoted managers attending their first leadership workshop. They expected a presentation about financial strategy or market expansion. Instead, Daniel placed an ordinary silver coffee tray on the conference table. The room became quiet with curiosity. "This," he said with a gentle smile, "represents the most valuable leadership lesson I have ever received." Several managers looked at one another with puzzled expressions. Daniel continued, A year ago, our company almost approved a decision that appeared perfect on paper. 7 experienced executives reviewed it. Lawyers examined it. Analysts modeled it. I trusted it. Then someone with no authority, no executive title, and no reason to impress anyone asked one respectful question. That question protected more than $200 million and reminded all of us that wisdom is never guaranteed by position. He did not mention Emily Carter by name. He believed the lesson belonged to everyone willing to practice it. The managers listened carefully as Daniel closed his notebook. If your organization ever reaches a point where only senior people feel comfortable speaking, you have already accepted unnecessary risk. Across the city, Emily Carter continued serving guests with the same calm professionalism that had always defined her character. Regular customers appreciated her kindness. New employees admired her patience. She still carried a silver tray through the dining room with quiet confidence, never imagining herself as someone extraordinary. The handwritten letter from Daniel remained safely inside the wooden drawer beside her father's pocket watch. She rarely opened it, because she no longer needed to read the words to remember their meaning. One peaceful evening, after the last guests had left, Emily switched off the lights in the private dining room where everything had begun. She paused beside the window overlooking Manhattan and smiled softly before picking up the final coffee cup from the polished table. Outside, the city continued moving with endless energy. Inside, the room stood perfectly still. Nothing suggested that one ordinary evening had quietly influenced the future of a billion-dollar company. Yet some of the greatest changes never announce themselves with applause. They arrive in silence, carried by humility, protected by courage, and remembered because someone cared enough to ask one honest question. Daniel never forgot that lesson. Emily never realized how many people would benefit from it. And every time another meeting at Brooks Capital began with one simple unanswered question, the quiet legacy of that evening continued to shape decisions far beyond a single contract, proving that genuine leadership is not measured by how loudly someone speaks, but by how carefully someone listens before choosing the next step.